Good morning. I'm Martha Boudreau, Regional President with Fleischman Hillard International Communications. And on behalf of Fleischman Hillard and our friends at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, welcome to today's panel on digital diplomacy. We are all continually hearing about the unrelenting expansion of social media's use around the globe, and there's no question that the number of users is quite impressive. And on the very eve of Facebook becoming a public company, it is closing in on 1 billion monthly users around the world. But the relevance of social media channels to diplomacy goes far beyond the usage numbers. Today, we're going to hear from some of Washington's leading thinkers and practitioners in the space. They will discuss the evolution of public diplomacy and the ways that visionary diplomats are using these powerful new tools to connect cultures, increase awareness, and advocate policy positions. As we'll hear today, the universal use of social media has important strategic implications for the diplomatic community because it has fundamentally changed the ways that governments engage with their citizens and position themselves on the global stage. In short, we see 3 fundamental ways social media is impacting the art of diplomacy. First, in the past, governments disseminated their messages far and wide in the hopes of reaching a select few. And now they are able to speak directly to their target audiences, and if those messages are found compelling, they are magnified by audience members who rebroadcast them through their own networks, which of course gives them greater reach and credibility. Turkish Ambassador Namık Tan, a friend and client of Fleischman Hillard, showed this year that he used Twitter to break the news that his government had negotiated the release of 3 New York Times journalists who were imprisoned in Libya. Secondly, social media is all about building new and often unexpected connections. Conversations shift and expand as they move through the online environment, which is why monitoring and listening are essential. Your ability to listen has become just as important as your ability to speak and to respond. And finally, social media has empowered users by shifting control to the audience. Governments interested in containing news are no longer able to do so. The audience has a point of view, they have the power to pick it up and to drive it through their communities, and their comments, whether they be unfair or incendiary, are now passed on to other people that the sender may not have intended to reach or may not have been able to reach. So social media now determines the size and the scope of an issue, and this dynamic alone has changed perceptions around the world in terms of responsibility, accountability, leadership, and justice. Throughout these changes brought on by social media, there is some that believe that they are disruptive. But that's not bad for the business of diplomacy. Statecraft has always been about creating and managing relationships. And today with social media, there's just another channel and a broader one and more informal one in which to do that. So now it's my pleasure to turn this over to our extremely distinguished panel, which will be led by Tom Carver. Tom is Vice President for Communications and Strategy at Carnegie. He was an award-winning journalist at the BBC for 20 years. 7 of those years were spent here in Washington as BBC's correspondent. During that time, he covered September 11 and its aftermath, 2 presidential election campaigns, and he accompanied Presidents Clinton and Bush and Vice President Cheney on multiple international trips. So again, thank you for joining us this morning, and I turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Martha. Well, thank you and good morning, and thank you for coming, and I think we are going to have an extremely interesting discussion. Let me introduce our panel. First of all, on my right, your left, is Ambassador Harold Forsyth, the ambassador to the United States for Peru. Ambassador Forsyth's had a very distinguished diplomatic career. You've been ambassador to China and Turkey and Chile, correct, for Peru. And on his left is Alec Ross, who is the senior advisor for innovation to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I think probably one of the best titles in government you could possibly find.
You get good titles when you make them up yourself.
Well, there you go. And that just speaks to the fact that Alec, I think, is really one of the pioneers of this subject of digital diplomacy. He was head of technical innovation for the Obama campaign and was brought in by Secretary of State Clinton very shortly after the election in 2008 to start to begin this transformation of the State Department in terms of how does this digital technology affect diplomacy. So we're very lucky to have him here, and I think it'll be very interesting to hear from him. On my left is a good friend, Ambassador Arturo Sarucan of Mexico. Ambassador Sarucan has been ambassador here since 2007 and was formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs in the Mexican government, and was also head at one stage of the Counter-Narcotics Office. And on my far left is Sarah Wynn-Williams, who is manager for public policy at Facebook. And I think, given the fact, as Martha said, that it's a big day for your company tomorrow, we are very lucky to have you here. Sarah has asked me to ask you that despite the great interest in Facebook at the moment with the IPO, that she is unable, for obvious reasons, to answer any questions directly about the IPO. So we should respect that. So what we're going to do is just have a discussion here on stage, and then we will open it up to you. I'm sure you've got many questions. You see here up on the screen here, we're doing a live feed, a Twitter feed of this. And so if you have comments or questions you want to post during the discussion, please put it up here, and we'll do our best to incorporate it. I think Martha said some very pertinent things about this, and there's many things to say. I mean, I would just add a couple of comments that struck me in reading about this. Is one of the interesting articles that came out in about 2009 by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who many of you know, in Foreign Affairs, called Power in the Network Century. And I think one of the things she said in there, which was extremely interesting, that the future successful governments are going to be those not with the largest armies, but those with the most connections. In other words, those that are at the center of the most number of networks. And I think that is obviously a hugely disruptive concept and a very interesting one. I mean, my famous countryman Winston Churchill once described diplomacy as the art of telling someone to go to hell so well that they ask for directions. So how do you tell someone to go to hell in 140 characters in a diplomatic way? I think it's a very interesting idea. And I think that Hillary Clinton, with Alex's help, has really pioneered this at the State Department to a remarkable degree. And as I'm sure we'll hear from Alex, the belief in the State Department that open societies, open platforms is not only good for America, but good for the world. But there are clearly limits. I mean, or it can be a double-edged sword. I mean, we only have to look at the difficulties that Ambassador Mike McFaul, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who formerly was a senior associate here at Carnegie, has had in his relationships with the Putin administration by tweeting about the protests earlier this year. And, of course, Ambassador Ford in Syria, in his tweets to the Syrian people during the uprisings, caused him to be expelled from the country. And so, you know, this thing can work both ways. You could argue that this is not always the best tool for diplomacy. And I think, you know, there are clearly limits. I mean, when the WikiLeaks happened, for instance, and a large number of State Department documents was put out on the internet, that was the form of openness that the State Department did not welcome so much. So I think, you know, it's a very much an evolving and interesting subject. But let me, I think probably appropriately we should start in the order of those that have the most Twitter followers. And my ambassador friend here has a very impressive 76,000. But I'm afraid he's put in the shade by my neighbor here, Alec, who has something like 370,000. Am I right?
Sounds about right.
Sounds about right. When you last looked. So why don't we start with Alec? And what do you understand digital diplomacy to mean?
Sure. Digital diplomacy, or what my boss, Secretary Clinton, calls 21st century statecraft, builds on traditional forms of diplomacy to account for the technologies, the demographics, and the networks of the 21st century. So I think it's important to take sort of a non-technologically deterministic point of view of this. I don't really care about technology. I was a medieval history major. But I care deeply about our foreign policy. And I think that that's the point of view of Secretary Clinton. It's that this technology is quite interesting, but the widgetry in and of itself is of little to no interest to us. But what is actually of interest to us is advancing our foreign policy interests. And so what 21st century statecraft seeks to do is to recognize the devolution of power that's taking place right now, the devolution of power from hierarchies, including the nation state, to citizens and networks of citizens by virtue of increasingly ubiquitous and powerful information networks. So in a world of changing geopolitical power facilitated in part by the internet, how do we adapt our statecraft? Now, I do feel compelled to make one correction from your introduction, which is about Rob Ford in Syria. He actually was not expelled from Syria. He actually left voluntarily. Right. And his use of social media actually has been remarkably successful in that it's the way in which Syrians are getting a lot of information that they can't get through traditional media. I would also point out about Mike McFaul in Russia. You know, Ambassador McFaul had a very simple binary choice. He could be quiet and weak, or he could be public and strong. And his use of social media in Russia, I think, he's chosen the road of being public and being strong. Now, if he wanted to spend the next couple of years doing nothing but going to the ballet, then he could do that. But instead, what he's chosen is a posture where he's strongly advancing America's foreign policy interests, using social media as one of the tools in his toolbox. So in the cases of both McFaul and Ford, I would disagree saying that, you know, this shows the pitfalls. Rather, I would show that it shows just how strong an ambassador can be in the year 2012. They aren't just there to go to ballets.
But, I mean, I think that's a very powerful argument, but many people would say that diplomacy is often best done in a closed room behind closed doors in private.
Completely agree with that.
So how does that sit with this diplomacy by Twitter?
So let's talk about Arturo Sarukhan and myself. So Ambassador Sarukhan and I sometimes will engage publicly. You know, we can share information publicly. You know, if I see him make a tweet that's compelling about the economic ties between the United States and Mexico, it provides a good opportunity for us to work together to amplify that which we are working together towards to strengthen the bilateral relationship. There are other times where we might be working on something of a sensitive nature, where we don't want our combined 500,000 followers on social media to be able to see and hear that in real time. In fact, what we need is good old-fashioned, discreet, behind closed doors diplomacy. So the need to occasionally be more public and more open does not come at all at the exclusion of what remains the heart of diplomacy, which is discreet government-to-government communications. This builds on traditional forms of diplomacy. It does not destroy older forms of diplomacy. Okay.
Well, Ambassador, how do you respond to that? Is your experience the same as Alex?
I think it is in a lot of ways. I think it has to, at least from a diplomat's point of view, from a foreign ministry's point of view, social media and how you use social media to advance a diplomatic agenda has to be seen and understood as an ancillary effort. We're not moving diplomacy away from the traditional way that we've conducted diplomacy to conducting diplomacy through social media. It's not one thing instead of the other. This is a tool. It is a very important tool. In fact, if Winston Churchill had said what you just quoted in the digital age, he probably would have said, diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell and actually making them enjoy the trip. Because I think a lot of what we're trying to use these platforms for is to redirect, to provide nuance, to provide context. Sometimes, yes, we do very aggressively push a point of view out there. I did it last night with Alabama's very unfortunate law. And again, this proves what you were mentioning. There's a very fine line between, being effective and creating a backlash either of people who follow you or of the host government.
Right.
So there's always a very thin line, but it has to be an ancillary effort. It cannot substitute the rest of the instruments that you have in your toolbox. But I do think that in Mexico many years ago, when the PRI had been in power for 70 years, there was an old saying that if you moved, obviously politically, but the saying was, if you moved, you don't appear in the photograph. El que se mueve no sale en la foto. Meaning that anyone that was politically active and doing his own stuff would not appear in the Politburo photograph.
Right.
In this day and age, if you don't tweet, you're not in the photo. It's completely changed the paradigm around.
Right.
And I think that's very relevant for ambassadors.
But can I ask you, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about this particular example of Alabama, but if you tweet something about a criticism of the host government, as it were, or of the host country, does that not complicate your then backroom discussions with that government? Because they might be rightly a bit annoyed.
It certainly can, and that's a risk that you have to take. But I think the ability of a diplomat that uses Twitter is to understand, or Facebook, or any of the social media tools, is to understand the national context you're operating in. If I was tweeting in X country vis-a-vis tweeting in the United States, the potential reactions of what I'm putting up there are going to be very different. So an able diplomat using these types of tools has to be fully cognizant of sort of either the written or unwritten rules of engagement and of the sensitivities to the use of these types of tools in the host country. Right. If you don't do that, then you're going to end up in a lot of trouble. But I do think that at the end of the day, what this is all about is understanding that the fundamental discussion in today's world is, as Alec has said, is between open and closed societies, and that the success of human societies through history has depended on social connections, and that as an ambassador, this is one of the most formidable tools to create those social connections.
Ambassador Forsyth, what's been your experience? Have you encountered any difficulty or improvements or changes in your relationship with countries where you've been ambassador because of this?
Well, thank you, Tom. I'm in the process of discovering this mystery. Precisely just a few months ago, I was speaking to my distinguished friend, the Mexican ambassador, and he explained to me the challenges of tweeting. So I began slowly.
How's it going?
To try. Well, I think it's exciting, but of course, I don't think there is any ambassador on this planet who can have the amount of followers that Arturo has. And she's been extremely successful.
You're 6 months, you'll get there.
Yeah, but I was planning to ask Arturo privately later, his secret, in order to get such an amount of followers, and he'll
reveal it to us all.
Some good pieces of advice. Yeah, but I read somewhere that diplomats.
I just follow Alex, so you have to ask Alex.
Hey, great. So yeah, but I was reading just a few days ago something interesting that we diplomats are used to wear white shirts, red ties, and perhaps exactly like Alec. Yeah. And more or less like myself. Yeah, and to have a flag behind and to interact with people in the same situation. And I've been doing that all my life. Yeah. So, but now we have to interact with a different tool, with different concepts, and that is what is being called now digital diplomacy. But yeah, please.
Well, I was just going to ask you, how supportive is your government about this? Are they pushing you to do it? Are they nervous about you doing it?
No, they are eager to learn. And I'm talking on behalf of my particular branch, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They are extremely interested to learn and perhaps to begin to start this model of the so-called digital diplomacy, which is for us traditional diplomats, with the red tie, something exciting, but at the same time is not a phrase that we have created. Somebody else has established that.
You're sitting next to him.
Exactly. That is okay. That is not a phrase that comes out from our world, from our science, which is also an art, and which is called traditionally diplomacy. Now, many years ago in the 90s, I began hearing the phrase economic diplomacy. Then, 10 years later, social diplomacy. Then public diplomacy, which is more or less new, and now digital diplomacy. So diplomacy is acquiring a lot of surnames, and I think that we have to cope with these new challenges and to try to understand how these challenges are going to reshape the way decisions in the international arena are taken, and more than that, I think that that will to some extent change dramatically the way diplomacy without surnames is produced in the world.
Let's talk to Sarah. I mean, one thing I didn't mention about Sarah, and you'll recognize it as soon as she starts speaking, is that she used to be a diplomat herself for the New Zealand diplomatic corps, and so you are in a unique position of being on kind of both sides of the fence, as it were. How do you think Facebook is? What's the role of Facebook in diplomacy?
Well, firstly, I think we have a saying at Facebook, which is we're only 1% done. So I'd be very tentative about trying to claim a particular role for Facebook. And that's one of the exciting things, particularly transitioning from diplomacy to working in social media, is that we don't spend a lot of time trying to define ourselves or what our role is. We're out there trying to take opportunities and to build on what others are doing. We're a platform. So it's exciting to see what's happening. So Syria is a great example where the ambassador has set up effectively a virtual embassy on Facebook, which, given the situation there, is a fantastic innovation. Now, if you could have said to people a decade ago that there'd be virtual embassies on a thing called Facebook, it's unthinkable. So we're at the very beginning of a journey, and I think we need to be very open-minded about where that ends up.
But what do you see happening? I mean, can you give us some examples, some sense of how Facebook is being used diplomatically?
Sure. So, I mean, there are lots of fascinating examples. That's one of them. What we're seeing, so recently the Prime Minister of the UK visited, William Hague visited Singapore, and a conversation happened in public. Instead of addressing a room like this, or instead of just meeting behind closed doors, notes were posted on each other's Facebook pages. So there was an opportunity for engagement for citizens of both countries. They're actually seeing the dialogue. And not only that, then citizens of both countries got to participate. They got to comment on the conversation, and you got a thread of hundreds of different comments. They became part of the diplomatic discourse. And that's an opportunity that didn't exist. Facebook is only 8 years old, and the diplomacy, and having been a diplomat, it's a very opaque business. It's very difficult for regular citizens, regular people on the street, to understand what is diplomacy. When I spoke to friends and families and said, I'm a diplomat, they'd be like, what does that mean? I assume you go to a lot of great cocktail parties. And this is bringing it out of the shadows. It's allowing people to see what is it that heads of state speak to with each other. And in many ways, one of the greatest things about Facebook is that it humanizes these leaders. So again, David Cameron the other day posted that his favorite album was a Pink Floyd album on his Facebook page.
That says a lot about him.
But see, we wouldn't have, and then people were able to comment and weigh in on that and share their opinions. And I'm sure, you have an opinion on that. Many people have opinions on that. And Facebook provides a platform to share that, to be part of that dialogue. And that's incredibly exciting.
So in some ways, you might find that these leaders are more popular outside their country than they are in them. One thing that we were talking beforehand, Alec, about how, and I was asking about how Mrs. Clinton kind of came upon this and what made her hire you and decide to do this big push. And you talked about her interest in power and how power is evolving. I mean, would you agree that this technology is causing a dilution of national sovereign and therefore government power to the expense of, relatively speaking, other organizations, institutions, corporations, civil society, and others?
Yes. So I do think that the internet is by its nature transnational in nature, and while one has to respect national sovereignty, the internet is disruptive within the framework of traditional notions of national sovereignty. So it does oftentimes undermine the power of hierarchies. That can be a large media company. It can be the nation state. And what you see empowered are citizens and networks of citizens. This can be for good. It can be for ill. I mean, you look, and this is not the case of sort of an American finger wagging at the rest of the world. I mean, look at the example of WikiLeaks. I think WikiLeaks is a proof point of this. The WikiLeaks organization WikiLeaks would not have been physically possible 10 years ago. The combination of processing power and bandwidth available at the desktop of a 22-year-old Army private would have been insufficient to download and distribute more than 250,000 alleged cables. Further, the WikiLeaks organization itself is largely made up of members and followers instead of paid staff. It has a web address instead of a street address. It's truly virtual and transnational in nature. That kind of distributed virtual organization that is truly transnational would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. And to think about how these kinds of distributed networks and distributed organizations can be engaged falls completely outside of the historic boundaries of bilateral diplomacy. So it poses enormous challenges. Now, it's important to say at this point, again, these are non-absolute. So it's not like, oh, the power of government is plummeting. No, these are incremental shifts, and these are relative shifts in sort of apportional power. But we are seeing it in nearly all 195 countries on planet Earth, from among the most powerful, like the United States and China, to among the smallest, who have difficulty managing their information environment in environments of information abundance.
But it is, to add on what Alec has said, it is riding a wave of a fundamental transformation occurring in the international system. It's in many ways, it's sort of a post-Westphalian international system where the nation state, as the integrator of how a state interacts with other communities and other states in the world community, is completely different. Not only is it eroding the traditional role that executive branches played in conducting diplomacy, if you look at a relationship like the Mexico-U.S. relationship that has such a multiplication of non-state actors that have a daily impact on the relationship, these tools simply add to and deepen what is already happening, which is, sorry, Harold, it's not the fuddy-duddy diplomats in Washington, D.C. or Mexico City or Lima who are conducting foreign policy. It's mayors and it's governors and it's Rotary clubs and it's state attorney generals. The atomization of how non-state actors, for good and for bad, because this also has relevance to some of the sort of post-Cold War challenges that we're dealing with. Transnational organized crime is one of them. When you stop to think for a minute that the same way we are taking advantage of these tools, transnational criminal organizations are also using these tools.
They're probably not tweeting. But
they're probably not tweeting, but they are watching what, for example, Watchdog or public figures in a city are tweeting about their activities.
Right.
They certainly are monitoring this. They're using social platforms to intimidate their rivals. So there's a double-edged sword, but at the end of the day, what I think is very relevant is that these social platforms mimic and accompany a profound, slow, it's not sort of a new international era, but a slow transformation of how state actors play a hand in international affairs. And again, I think my bilateral relationship with the United States is particularly relevant simply because we've got a 3,000-kilometer border and we've got 35 million Mexican Americans living in the United States, and this adds to this relationship dimensions that probably are not relevant for others. But this atomization of actors impacting the relationship goes hand in hand with how these tools are being used for bad and for good to conduct business and have an impact on how we diplomats interact with the bilateral relationship.
I also think the role of the diplomat has fundamentally changed. So, up until recently, the vast majority of diplomats spent their time gathering information. So and as many of you will know, often very mundane things that were simply not possible without technology. So you would have these vast embassies because, I served here in DC, and even when I started, we did not have the internet on our desktop, either here or at headquarters, which seems amazing. But a lot of our function was going and sitting in a congressional hearing and finding out what's going on, or going into State Department, and a lot of times sometimes official information, but also now things that are appearing on people's Facebook page. So I can look up, any sort of head of state, and from their photos I can often see, do they have a partner? How many children do they have? All of these pieces of information that you had to be a foot soldier on the ground previously, and that function has gone. And I think that's a real challenge for diplomacy, because diplomats have to redefine what it is they do. The vast bulk of people transferring information, which is what embassies did, that role, you can sit in, Wellington, New Zealand, and tune into a congressional committee. You don't need to have a junior diplomat on the ground.
So does this mean, do you think, the end of kind of embassies as we traditionally know it?
No, I don't think it's the end of embassies, but I think it's a challenge for embassies. I think they need to redefine where the value add is, because it's not simply enough to transfer information anymore. That information is available. That information can be accessed from any capital, anywhere in the world. So it's the social connection, and that's where Facebook comes in, which is often where the value add is.
But I would add, I completely agree, and I think there is an impact at the embassy level, which is the commercial advisor who was in half of the embassies in Washington, which was a cover for an intelligence agent, is no longer needed. Or at least the staff is being fundamentally reduced simply because open source information, the amount, I'll give you another example. As you know, Mexico has signaled its intention to the U.S. and to the TPP core nations that we want to access TPP, and we want to become a TPP member. There was a negotiation in Dallas with the core TPP group members this week. We, Mexicans, Canadians, and Japanese, have been sort of waiting for the core TPP countries to say, go ahead, we'll start consultations with you. As you know, one of the core issues of TPP is going to be IPR, intellectual property rights. Yesterday, courtesy of a very prominent chairman on Capitol Hill, the whole IPR confidential chapter that is being negotiated and discussed in Dallas was on Twitter. That's how I got the whole confidential IPR chapter. I didn't need to send a spy to Dallas. I didn't need to bug the room. I got it from the internet.
Right.
And that is having a profound impact on size of staff, of the role of some of the offices in the embassies. So there is a very important impact.
And you're getting specialists in social media. So embassies that didn't used to are now having public diplomacy programs. They're understanding the value, and it's a really big shift. And I think that given the sort of nature of foreign service, it's a real challenge, and it's exciting to see where that will end up. And I think it's still in a real period of transition.
Does that worry you, Ambassador? I mean, that you might lose kind of control to some degree of your embassy? Or?
We cannot deny that the production of diplomats in the future will rest and will rely more on the people in general terms, right, than on governments and than on diplomats. So the diplomacy itself will evolve to new forms, and it's for us to see and for us to wait how this is going to happen. I think that to some extent Arturo and I will survive. So we are not a dangerous species for now,
right?
But some new things will challenge our profession, and we cannot deny that. But Alec mentioned Wikipedia, and I myself have been one of the victims of the system. But the concept of wiki is extremely interesting because it means interaction. And there is a connection of what interaction is with our profession, which is by its own nature very interactive. So something interesting is that these tools give us the chance to interact with people. Yeah, but to what extent these people represent the views of our government? And anyway, we have to do things, we have to say things, and we have to use these tools, because if we don't, other people will. Right. And I'll give you an example. For instance, the so-called FARC. I was ambassador to Colombia, and they used to have a site for promoting their views. And this site was widely visited all over the world. So, but not only organizations like that, crime, child pornography, even drug traffickers, they use these tools. They have a lot of time.
That's what you said.
Yeah. And so if we don't cope with that, and we're living in an empty space, and that is how we diplomats have to learn.
Can I pick up on that example? Sure. I mean, I think FARC is a perfect example of the power of Facebook. So some of you may be aware there's a Colombian man, Oscar Morales, who started a Facebook page against FARC. And it went viral, and not within Colombia, globally. And this page and this Facebook and the effort on Facebook and the ability to connect people in Colombia with expatriate Colombian communities led to marches in the streets all around the world. It's incredibly powerful. And this wasn't someone who was recognized as a particular political activist. This wasn't someone who was empowered by any institution. This is someone who, regular citizen, had enough, took to Facebook, and fundamentally changed the issue.
Can I just, at a kind of strategic level, Alec, what in this new age, I'm sure this is something you've given a lot of thought to, what is the most important quality that a government or a diplomatic service is going to need to have to survive?
Yeah, so first it's analytical abilities. I tell all of our ambassadors, remember, you only have one mouth, but you have two ears. So people ought not view these networks as new ways of quote-unquote pushing a message out. I think that the efficacy of such a thing is actually fairly low. I think that the most important attribute is to be able to listen and analyze movement building, sentiment analysis, and other such things. If you are in Egypt in January, February of 2011, and your sole interlocutors were government ministers, generals, and CEOs, you had no idea what was going on in that country. If your traditional channels for information gathering and such things were not broadened to include social networks, you fundamentally did not understand what was happening in your country. So the most important attribute is the ability to listen and learn. And I actually think that a lot of the tools that are out there for helping diplomats listen are extremely crude. So there's much more art than science, in my opinion, in terms of one's ability to do this. So actually it helps to be a seasoned foreign policy hand, to be able to make non-algorithmic discernments about credible voices, non-credible voices, analyses of the kinds of communications and movements that are being built. So marrying the long-honed foreign policy expertise with a significantly large amount of information that is coming in, I think is the single most important attribute for a 21st century diplomat.
I thought you'd say that. Okay, I'm going to get to questions in a minute, but just before I do, I just want to ask each one of you one thing, which is, what's the future? I mean, where is this heading, do you think, Ambassador?
Well, it's extremely hard to answer your extremely interesting question. I guess that diplomacy will evolve, and the notion of career diplomats like ourselves will also evolve. Embassies, probably in 50 years, probably, I'm not a futurologist, but will not exist as we know now. They will be representation of plural interests, not only representations of governments by itself. And this digital revolution will change the process in which international policy exists. And the international relations will be much more democratized because of this. For one simple reason, it will not be possible to lie.
I'm sure people will find a way. Alec?
Wow. What's the future? I think that we are going to see a rise in fast-moving, largely leaderless movements. We've seen a few of them. Even again, I'll use the United States as an example. For those of you that are familiar with SOPA and PIPA, these were pieces of relatively obscure online piracy legislation in the bowels of congressional committees in Washington. And then citizen-centered movements were built on the internet that became very, very powerful, very, very fast. I think that the tools have become sufficiently sophisticated at this point that these citizen-centered, fast-moving movements are only going to grow in strength. You don't need somebody's face who you can put on a T-shirt to be able to organize and inspire the masses anymore. The nodal nature, the networked nature of the exercise of power is such that people can be brought together and organized in ways that weren't possible as recently as 3 years ago. So I think we are going to see more of this. I think we're going to see it happen with very little notice, and I think we're going to see it move nation states in increasingly interesting ways.
And that can obviously be for good and bad.
Look, Hillary Clinton put it best. She said, our information networks are like nuclear power. They can fuel a city or destroy it. The technology itself is value neutral. It is inanimate. It takes on the values and intentions of the users. All it does is amplify the existing sociologies on the ground. So it can be harnessed and put to effect by anybody for any purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
But so my question was, how do governments then, say you've got a leaderless, fast-moving movement that you don't like as a government, how does a government or a diplomatic service effectively combat that?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, if it's a democratic movement that you don't like, then if you live in a functioning democracy, then you have to live with the will of the people. If it is something more malignant in nature, if it's a criminal network or other such things, then it needs to be treated appropriately like a law enforcement movement or something like that. But the most important thing is to understand the nature of the movement making itself. Understand that behind any movement, whether, they can be complete polar opposites ideologically. It could be the Tea Party on one side, the Occupy movement on another. Behind a movement of any political nature, there's some force behind it. There's some impulse. There's some relevant public sentiment behind it. And so the more important thing than figuring out, quote unquote, how do I kill it, is what's behind it, what is driving the movement, how can I seek to understand it, and how then can I engage with it.
Right, interesting. Ambassador, where do you, from your perch, where does the future lie?
Well, certainly the future isn't what it used to be, and this is going to have a profound impact on how diplomats, embassies, foreign ministries do their job. For starters, I think it forces embassies, ambassadors, diplomats to be much more nimble and agile than we used to be in the past. For starters, if this tool is going to work, you can't wait to send in a tweet, have your home office then say okay or nay, and then tell you you're okay to put. You can't. That is long gone.
Right.
And for those of us who've been in the diplomatic service, you know that foreign ministries usually tend to work with a very sort of hierarchical and vertical organizational structure. This is completely breaking this asunder. If I'm going to tweet and I'm going to be effective, I'm not going to wait for the foreign ministry to say, yes, I do it, and they don't like it. It's their problem. So
in a way, it gives you more power.
It gives. Well, where I was headed is I think this will atomize the authority and the role and the profile of embassies and ambassadors. I think you will see a sort of a feudalization of diplomacy where, yes, the king is in London, but you've got 20 feudal lords who run their fiefdoms, and unless they really screw up, the king doesn't come and invade your castle.
Right.
I think that increasingly the embassies will become self-contained, small foreign ministries that will have, to be successful and to have an impact, will have to be much more autonomous and much more independent from foreign ministries in your home capital. So in terms of the diplomatic activities, I think that's the wave. I think we're headed in that direction. I concur with Alec. I think that it also opens up huge challenges as to how you take on, confront, build upon, work with social movements that use social media to make their case, whether it's SOPA, which was I agree, it was a very telling example of how these tools can, something which in principle would seem to make sense, which is a basic premise of, yes, you are free, you should be free to navigate the internet, but no, you shouldn't be pirating content on the internet, which is sort of a very basic and logical premise. This was completely shot out of the air, and the paradigm on this discussion is being completely reinvented because of what happened on social media. So I think this will be a very, very interesting process. And again, as we've said here, it'll be both positive and negative. You'll have potential terrorist groups, you'll have transnational organized crime, you'll have anti-democratic movements that will take advantage of these forces, and we have to be as nimble, as quick, as fast, as agile to be able to confront, contain, or take advantage of these processes.
Sarah?
So Facebook's mission is to make the world more open and connected, and in the future I see a lot more of both openness and connection. So after 8 years we have 900 million users, and it's an incredible platform. Alec and the ambassadors have spoken about the role of people in the future. I'm also interested in the role of the platform and how that's going to evolve. So even in the last few months, we released a citizen co-sponsor app, which allows people on their Facebook to say that they're co-sponsoring a piece of legislation, which again socializes it amongst their friends and family, educates people, and people become opinion formers. It's bringing them into the legislative process. In the future, I think we're going to see a great deal of sophistication in these sort of apps and just in the sophistication of the platform that's going to facilitate greater connection. On the sort of cultural level, after a decade of diplomacy and then going to Facebook, I feel like I went to polar extremes, and I think these worlds are going to have to come closer together. Facebook has another saying, which is move fast and break things. Embassies, I could not, hand on heart, say at the moment live that ethos, and that both are going to have to change. And that's going to be a really interesting tension as both take on facets of the role that the others do.
Because you almost say the diplomatic ethos was the opposite: move slowly and don't break anything. Right?
Certainly in the past. Certainly,
absolutely. And I think that risk aversion is going to have to change.
Right. Okay, well, let's open it up to questions. If you could just stand up, there's a microphone will come to you. Please say who you are and where you're from. This gentleman here on the left. There's a microphone right behind you.
I'm Rich Kozlerich from George Mason University, and I was the U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan and to Bosnia. Two comments. I think we have to not confuse the tools of diplomacy with what the objective of diplomacy is. The objective is to accomplish foreign policy of the country that sent you to that place. And relationships are fine, but they're a subset of the broader objective. I remember when I was in Azerbaijan in 1994, a journalist got beat up. I went to the hospital to visit him. That got around, both in the news and otherwise. I'm thinking if I would have done that today and Twittered my concern about that journalist, it wouldn't have had the same impact. So I think we need to be very, very conscious of the fact that these are only tools. They can help. But at the end of the day, diplomacy is about person-to-person engagement in the societies. Last, in defense of ballet, I regularly attended the ballet in Azerbaijan. And my wife and I had our picture on TV every night that the ballet was on, because there wasn't a whole lot else to talk about in 1994. That showed the U.S. ambassador as being engaged in the cultural life of that country. So, I think we've got to be a little careful here, not to get overwhelmed by the technology, and remember what diplomacy is about in the final analysis, and the fact that ambassadors need to be seen as personally engaged in a country, not just as a remote participant.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, it is a good point, isn't it, that we can't lose sight of the person-to-person
But I think it's a
contact.
point that was just made by everybody on the panel. I mean, I said that in my introductory remarks, I said, I don't care about technology, I care about our foreign policy interests. So I think that you've got nothing but agreement from those of us here.
Well, there is something interesting in what the ambassador is saying, and that clearly reflects the contradiction and the very need to define more precisely what digital diplomacy is. He says, of course, that we cannot confuse things, that these tools are an instrument, are just a medium, a mean. And that is true. And he also says that we cannot forget that we represent one specific objective as diplomats, protecting and defending the national interests of our country. That is true. But at the same time, as it has been said here, the world is evolving. The internet cyber world is one single space. So national objective at some point will have to merge with international objectives, with values that we all share: democracy, promotion and respect of human rights, well-being, protection of nature, and all these things. So the very notion of national interest will, at some point, start evolving because of this digital challenge. Well, it's just a guess.
Okay. This gentleman here, second row.
Thank you, all of you, for taking your time. My name is Chang. I'm from the State Department, Bureau of Educational Cultural Affairs. We're in the business of bringing about 50,000 people a year on exchanges. Question for you all is this. It sounds like there's agreement in the panel that this is a means, and it's influencing how we go about doing business. Are there any thoughts on whether it's influencing the what, the end goals of diplomacy? That is to say, it's clear that the internet, just like many disruptive technologies, is opening up new possibilities. Does that make the users maybe see new desires, maybe open up frontiers for what they want that they couldn't dream of wanting before? So yes, it's influencing how we go about doing business. Is it influencing at all what we want as an end goal?
Okay. Do you want to have a go at that, Ambassador? I mean,
I don't think the use of, and again, riffing on what Alec just said and the ambassador's concerns, I don't think anyone up here thinks or believes that this is substituting foreign policy objectives or drivers. Using social media in no way has changed the objectives that I set out to do when I arrived as an ambassador before I started using social media. Again, it's sort of it's an ancillary instrument that expands the potential of attaining those goals. But I don't think they change the foreign policy objectives of what we're trying to do in the relationship with the United States. It does allow me, given that I am absolutely convinced that these two countries are the most uniquely important countries to each other on the face of the earth, and therefore the social connections and the sense of co-stakeholdership between our two societies so important, that it has allowed us to do much more intelligently and aggressively, simply because this is a tool that allows you to develop and to enhance and to provide those social connections.
I think it's changed the expectation of citizens to some extent. I think that people have a greater expectation of access to information, and there's a greater ability to sort of know these people in a more personal way. I mean, certainly through the way that people develop their Facebook pages or release information via Facebook.
The only thing I would add to this is if you look backwards on the Arab Spring, you cannot segregate out social media, but the combination of pan-Arab satellite television, Al Jazeera in particular, but the combination of pan-Arab satellite television and social media clearly spread the sense of what was possible from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Syria, perhaps originally originating in Iran. But clearly the sense of what was possible was widely disseminated through a combination of pan-Arab satellite television and social media.
Right. Let's take one from the back. This lady in blue on the aisle. Just wait for a Microphone.
Hello, my name's Catherine Fitzpatrick. I have a blog, Wired State. I have a question for Alec. Recently, there was an article in Tech President, maybe you saw, about Anish Chopra and the website that's called We the People, which is White House Gov/petitions. And an activist commented about this site that it was a great circumvention of Congress. And when I read that, I had to wonder whether these tools, in fact, are undermining not the state but democracy. Because when you advocated against SOPA, that never came to a vote. I mean, basically, you and your G+ friends and your Facebook friends could organize a preemptive announcement of a veto, and there was never a vote. I'm just saying the dynamics of it, whatever the popular sentiment is. So what do you think the repercussions are when the platforms themselves and you using those platforms can frame the issue such that it circumvents checks and balances?
The original Constitution.
So that's an excellent question. So the tension is essentially between direct democracy and representative democracy. I was in Jerusalem just 10 days ago, and I was meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and this was the first question he asked me, was about the tension between direct democracy and representative democracy as facilitated by these platforms. I will not pretend to be omniscient about this. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how things evolve over the next couple of years. What I will say is that I think that platforms like We the People give voice to individuals in Congress that they otherwise would not necessarily have access to right now. Right now, Washington, too much power is concentrated in the hands of lobbyists. So if you can hire somebody for $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a month, then your voice can be heard in Congress. Part of what We the People has done, it has taken individuals and networks of individuals who are not going to go hire a fancy K Street law firm, but suddenly it gives them a seat at that table. And so in the case of SOPA, for example, there wasn't a vote in part because I think 17 co-sponsors took their name off of the bills because of what they heard from their citizens. And so I think that part of the distribution of power here is from elites who can pay $30,000 a month for a lobbyist to citizens who as individuals or as small groups previously wouldn't be empowered, but by being able to come together in groups of tens of thousands of people of like mind, suddenly have a seat at the table that they could never buy. Now, having said that, it is going to be interesting, and I will not pretend to be omniscient about what this will mean in the next 12, 18, 24 months in terms of the tensions between direct and representative democracy. I do think that there's clear evidence that one of the things that social media does is it tends to punish moderation. I think that it tends to amplify voices at the extreme of the political spectrum. It tends to help people on whether it's the left of the left and the right of the right. The moderates tend to be and those seeking compromise seem to be those that are being most punished within social media domains. It's going to be very interesting to see how this evolves over the next year or two.
Okay, even though the question was directed to Alec, I'd like to jump in on this because I do think that this is a very important discussion. And in part, I fully agree with Alec, but I would also add that part of the challenge, and you're seeing it in the U.S., you're seeing it in Greece, you're seeing it in the European Union, you're seeing it in some parts of Latin America, Chile, you saw it in Israel. There is a growing challenge to liberal with a capital L, not an ideological inclination, but of a democratic regime that through a liberal democracy has the checks and balances on who has the power. And you see increasingly that traditional political structures and political parties across the world are no longer seen by citizens as valid conveyor belts of their concerns, their aspirations with the public policy process. In this country, there's one way of explaining the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. They're two extremes of two disaffected groups of individuals of society that feel that the traditional political parties have stopped being representative of their aspirations, dreams, beliefs, and you're seeing this widespread across the world. And so I think that in many ways, despite the potential pitfalls that this may have down the road, I think it is injecting some direct democracy back into a lot of decision-making process. And despite the challenges, I think we should welcome it and embrace it.
Okay. A couple more. Yes, this gentleman here with the pink tie had his hand up before.
Yes, my name is Mark Botsford from Botsford Global. My question talks to your last point, Alec, and to you, the ambassador, concerning managing, regarding the future of direct democracy and managing the movements themselves. You spoke about engaging with these movements. Can you speak a little bit more about how you see that process going forward? How do you see the management and the direction of these movements towards individual national self-interest going forward?
Yeah, so I would actually defer to Ambassadors Forsyth or Sarukhan on this, who, it would be interesting to think about this over the spread of decades of engagement with movements of different type. What I would say is that the way that I see this in part is you've got to, in the parlance of diplomacy, you've got to broaden your interlocutors. So historically, on the 7th floor of the State Department where I work, our interlocutors are government ministers, generals, CEOs, chiefs of newspapers, political party heads, the tops of hierarchies. From my standpoint in engaging with these movements, part of what we've got to do is broaden the types of individuals and networks of individuals with whom we interact. So as a very practical matter, in order to become an American ambassador right now, you have to spend some time with me. You get trained at the Foreign Service Institute by me, all rising ambassadors. And we talk about this, and part of this is, with using the traditional instruments of diplomacy, the same instruments that were used in the 1990s in Azerbaijan, what the ambassador would have done oftentimes, one of the most effective things he could do is invite people into his home, invite people into the embassy, and connect and engage directly with them, people to people. The difference today, it's the same approach, but instead you might be engaging with a different set of individuals in this sense. So if a movement is driven by a network of individuals, you have to use some of the old-fashioned diplomatic skills in identifying the leaders of that movement and invite them into the embassy, invite them into your home, and have discussions with them, as opposed to just interacting with the traditional interlocutor in government. You don't stop interacting with your traditional interlocutors, but you broaden it to include new types of people.
But you said the future was leaderless movements. How do you engage with a leaderless movement?
Part of it is virtually. Part of it is using tools like Twitter and Facebook. So if there isn't the one person with whom you would sit sort of across the mahogany table having a cup of tea, then this is an appropriate occasion for using the open platforms that various of the individuals in the movement are using.
Ambassador?
There is something interesting, but that concept that you mentioned exceeds a little bit the idea of digital diplomacy, and it goes to this digital revolution and how it affects society in general terms, and of course, the production of policies and politics in general are dramatically affected by this. But I think in more or less the same way that TV, for instance, began affecting democracy, probably in positive terms, in the early 50s when the first TV ad for a president, it was, I think, President Eisenhower, was aired, I think in 1953 or something. And politicians all over the world have to use these tools. And that normally can work in their own favor. For instance, there was a candidate in the last elections, in the presidential elections in Peru. He wasn't able to win the elections, but he was extremely successful using these tools for the first time. And he was able to gather some 20% of the votes or something. But at the same time, these tools can be used against candidates and against specific policies also. And that is why we're speaking about a revolution, but that to some extent exceeds the concept of diplomacy. That might be too much for us to handle.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I think this lady right at the back on the left.
Hi, my name is Mary Kane. I am the president of Sister Cities International. We're a citizen diplomacy group that connects communities all over the world. And we are a 56-year-old organization. And there's nothing that's going to change face-to-face exchanges. However, I need help in telling my members why we need to use digital diplomacy to enhance our efforts.
So you haven't been convinced what you've heard so far? Okay.
Elevator speech would be great.
Right. Okay, why don't you start with Facebook?
Well, we've actually had the opportunity to meet prior to this panel and go through some of the ways that Facebook can help. And I think, again, it's just that ability to facilitate engagement, whether you're a politician, whether you're a citizen diplomat, and part of the discussion that we had is allowing people to have those conversations or look at different ways of educating each other, using the platform, using videos, using lots of ways because you're bringing diplomacy onto the street, basically, and you're trying to empower your citizen diplomats to go out and spread the message and also to educate others about, the important role that the everyday person plays in diplomacy. And we've talked throughout this panel about the value that Facebook has in doing that.
Okay. Well, I think we go to, obviously, there are many more questions than answers at this stage in this thing. I should take one question from Twitter, appropriately. And there's really for the ambassadors, which says, do you Twitter on behalf of yourself, or does someone else do it?
Certainly. I think that I may get into trouble here. Any ambassador that does not do it is running the risk of then having to explain why a word, a phrase, was put up there by someone else, which you're not responsible for, and which has put you in a load of trouble. So, yes, I do it personally. What we do is each week we assemble a team of officials in the embassy that sort of look at calendar events that are going to occur next week. I don't know, today was the International Telecom Day. So last Friday we decided that we wanted to say something today about the day. So what we do is we design the tweet, especially when we're linking to a page that will add information or provide nuanced context, which will direct people to information that we think is valuable. We put the link, we have them ready, but I run down the list of every single pre-arranged tweet. I sign off, we say this one's going to go up at such and such time, and then all the others, last night's Alabama's, if there's a vote right now on the Hill which I want to say something about, if you're not responsible for doing it yourself, you're going to be sooner or later in deep trouble. So yes, I do it on my own.
And do you feel under pressure to reveal the more personal aspects of yourself? I mean, it's a very personal form of communication.
I try not to.
Tweet about your children or whatever?
No. I've tried to maintain a very sort of a firm box of what I'm putting up there, and it's related to work. If I start tweeting about, I played soccer this morning and won, that's another story. And then if I want to do that, I should have a personal account to do that, whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter. I am using Twitter to convey the foreign policy objectives of the embassy, of the ambassador, and of the Mexican government.
Okay. Yeah. Tom, well, I'll try to answer in 140 characters. But yes, I tweet and I do it myself. But as everything in life, you have to do it when you have something to say and when you know that you're going to be heard. And that is the hardest thing in Twitter, according to my experience. But Arturo has given me a great idea. I will start, a few diplomats of my embassy are here, so I will start gathering them and requesting them to produce concepts and ideas from now on. Okay.
Believe me, Harold, they will hate your guts for it.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think we will end. Thank you very much, Ambassador Forsyth, Alec Ross, Ambassador Sarah Khan, and Sarah Wynn-Williams.